We are going to begin with the opening ceremony and the welcoming address from the organizing entities of this fourth Forum on Latin American Democracy. Please take your seats. We ask the media to help us sitting down, please. Good afternoon to everybody. Our next panel on this fourth Forum on Latin American Democracy, it's a welcoming address on behalf of the organizing entities of this fourth Forum. Please allow me to introduce the distinguished members of the Presidium. The Presidium is headed by the Minister of Public Education, Emilio Chofet Chemor, Leonardo Valdés Urita, Chairman of the Board of the IFES, Justice Alejandro Luna, Chief Justice of the Electoral Court, of the Federal Electoral Court, Manuel Ordorica, Secretary General of the Colegio de México, Mr. José Miguel Insulza, Secretary General of the OAS, we also have the pleasure of having with us the President of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, Mr. William Sweeney. And in representation of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Radrifa Rodriguez, she is the Commissioner for Public Control. To begin with our opening ceremony or welcoming address, I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Ordorica. Good afternoon. Mr. Emilio Chofet, Secretary or Minister of Education, the President of El Colegio de México, Leonardo Valdés, Chairman of the Board of the IFES, Dr. José Miguel Insulza, Secretary General of the OAS, José Alejandro Luna Ramos, Chief Justice of the Federal Electoral Court, Mr. William Sweeney, President of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to welcome you to El Colegio de México. This academic institution opened its doors in 1938, 75 years ago as the Casa de España, and then it changed in 1990 as El Colegio de México, integrating Mexican scholars and Spanish scholars as well as other nationalities. From the very beginning, El Colegio de México has had the goal of developing high-quality human resources with high level of education to offer solutions to the main economic, social, political, and demographic issues of our country. Here, the demographic research with which the new population policy was developed were created, almost at the same time as the first studies about international migration were created. Also, from these places, the guidelines for the free trade agreement were created. Different researchers of El Colegio have participated in the evaluation of the electoral roster and other instruments that are very important for the consolidation of our democracy and the good development of our elections. In the case of the political life, El Colegio de Mexico has bet on three most important elements. Democracy cannot be without institutions. Democracy cannot be without criticism. Democracy cannot be without the values that give logic to it. Very few institutions have formed so many officers that have worked with their knowledge in the government at a very high levels of public administration, with which they want to improve the quality of life of our population and to strengthen the democratic life of our country. El Colegio has also had the development of different officers that now work in the IFE or have worked in the IFE before. An example is the chairman of the board of the IFE, Leonardo Valdés, who studied his PhD in this institution. The role of El Colegio de Mexico is the formation of scholars with critical intuition and citizens with democratic values. And the thinking and knowledge, it's always the basis of the academic development. Ladies and gentlemen, El Colegio de Mexico is proud that for the third occasion, the Forum of Latin American Democracy is organized in these buildings, with the gathering of important guests that will talk about the most likely solutions for the main issues in the Latin American region. Thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Ordorica. Now I am going to pass the floor to the Justice Alejandro Luna Ramos, Chief Justice of the Electoral Court. Mr. Emilio Chofet, Minister of Education. Leonardo Valdés Zurita, Chairman of the Board of the Electoral Institute. Dr. Ordorica, Secretary General of El Colegio de Mexico. Dr. José Miguel Insulza, Secretary General of the OAS. Mr. William Sweeney, President and Executive Director of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Farieda Rodriguez, representing the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning to everybody. I appreciate the honor of having me participating in this important event for the electoral systems of our regions. In the case of Mexico, I must point out that the Federal Electoral Institute represents a fundamental element in the electoral mesh, because due to its nature, that is made up of citizens, we can argue that in our country, it is the Mexican citizens, the ones that organize the elections, the ones that vote, the ones that count the votes, and even though it's only been present for 23 years, the IFE represents the maturity of a country that throughout many years has fought for the setting up of democracy. Thanks to the full performance of its constitutional goal. In this order of ideas, I must highlight that the institutions cannot be what they are without the people that work in them. And close to the ending of his administration, I have to take this opportunity to highlight the performance of Mr. Valdés Zurita as the head of the IFE. He's managed to guide the IFE with the best of the qualities that a leader must have. Prudence, number one, which has always been a complement of his loyalty to the best needs of the citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, the Electoral Court of the Federal Judicial Branch is happy to be with the Electoral Federal Institute, the partners in the organization of the electoral system in Mexico. I know that all the authorities and the entities here represented have each one its own special responsibility and its own commitment for Mexico. And in this fourth forum, I pray so that we always guide the citizens of our country to the consolidation of our democratic systems. Thank you very much. Thank you to Justice Luna Ramos. I also want to tell the audience that we have witnesses of honor in this session, in this welcoming address. We have two former presidents of Latin America, Carlos Mesa from Bolivia and Mr. Reina from the Dominican Republic. Thank you for being here with us. Now I pass the floor to Dr. Leonardo Valdés Zurita. This forum has been organized in conjunction with the OAS for several years. So Miguel and I always need to get organized in how long we're going to talk and what we're going to talk about. Mr. Chofet, Secretary of Minister of Education and representative of the President of Mexico, Mr. Peña Nieto. José Miguel Insulza Salinas, Secretary General of the OAS. Dr. Manuel Ordorica Mellado, Secretary General of the Colegio de Mexico. Justice José Alejandro Luna Ramos, President of the Electoral Court of the Federal Judicial Branch. Mrs. Velasco, Head of the Political Development Unit of the Minister of Internal Affairs, and Mr. William Sweeney, President of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear participants to this forum, former presidents of sister countries in Latin America, ladies and gentlemen, inequality is the #1 menace to our democracies. More than 2 decades of having free and fair elections have sent authoritarianism away from our countries. However, the concentration of wealth has not been well balanced. The consolidation of democratic systems is not enough to generate economic policies that could have a better allocation of resources. According to the CEPAL, taking into account the constant growth of Latin America and the increase in the per capita product in the region, 1 out of each 3 Latin Americans still live under poverty. We need to look at this situation as a red light to change the traditional focus that we have given to the situation by the democratic institutions. It is clear that the compass that we need for the changes, it's been determined by the demands of a previous election. That way of doing our democracies guarantees short-term stability. However, it does not create a contextual vision for the future that guides the legislative affairs and the priority of public policies. More than 2 decades of democratization must give place to our next political transformation in our continent, the furthering of the institutions for the well-being of our societies. To update our institutions without taking into account the great trends of the international context will leave us in the hands of those that want to participate in the change of the future. With that purpose, the OAS and the IFE have agreed to organize once a year a forum during which the main topics that from the international point of view are needed to develop democratic systems in the region. And that is how we organized in 2010 the first forum on Latin American democracy that was also used to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Federal Electoral Institute. During these forums, we have analyzed the challenges so that the democracies go for citizens' democracies. We have studied the influence of money in politics and in elections, and we have also thought about the risks of the crisis of political representation. Now, in 2013, in our fourth forum on Latin American democracy, which begins today, we hope that our insight and debates help us to create new guidelines for the new institutional changes that we need in our electoral systems, democratic systems. As you know, we have three focal points: inequality, poverty, and insecurity. Just as in previous forums, the presentations are going to be handled by experts, academics, officers, and members of the media from three different continents. I must point out that to the original organization effort, we now have the participation of El Colegio de México, institution that's been the headquarters for these forums since last year, the Fondo de Cultura Económica, that has supported each one of the publications used as guideline in the forum, and the and the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, known as IFES. Thank you to all of you for your support and enthusiasm. It's because of your creativity and conviction that we will be able to achieve the goal of our democracies, which is not just to achieve the goals, but to create well-being for the population. To distribute political power in the voting areas is not the only thing that we have to do. We have to find the way to redistribute the wealth. And that is why we need to have a prompt transformation of our institutions in order to guarantee the pertinence and efficacy of our political policy, of our public policies. We, as Mexicans, know that it is true, and we are totally aware of it, and that is why we share with all objectivity the experiences that we have had in our country, in our continent, and in other countries of the world. That is why, on behalf of the board members, of the General Board, and of each member of the Federal Electoral Court, of the Federal Electoral Institute, I want to thank you for participating in this forum and making it the #1 space to talk about democracy in our continent. To be honest, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to say that we have begun the works so that the 5th Forum on Democracy next year, besides updating the main topics that have to do with democracy, we will also approach in a wide manner the topic of women and democracy in the Americas. I announced this with pride during the 60th anniversary of the passive and active vote for women in our country. So please, deem yourselves from now on as a special guest to the 5th forum on Latin American democracy, ladies and gentlemen, so that the institutional modifications do have as a result a better allocation of our countries in the concert of nations. It is very important that we solve the problem of inequality and to take into account the main trends of economy and international policies. To ease the knowledge of the main international process in use and the best practices in use with which we can favor the development of new institutions and to have more efficient public policies is the goal of this forum. And in order to do so, the organizers and the participants are here to share ideas with which we can further the future of democracy in Latin America. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you to the chairman of the Electoral Institute, and now I pass the floor to Dr. Insulza, Secretary General of the OAS. Thank you and good morning. Emilio Chofet, Minister of Public Education, Leonardo Valdés, Chairman of the Board of the Federal Electoral Institute, Pedro Ordorica Mellado, Secretary General of El Colegio de México, Alejandro Luna, Head of the Electoral Court, and Mr. Sweeney, President of IFES, and Mrs. Alidia Rodriguez, representative of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the representative of International IDEA, Mr. Davila. I also want to greet the former presidents of Bolivia and the Dominican Republic, as well as the ambassador of Mexico to the OAS, and to all the ambassadors and representatives here, to the general public. The only thing that changes in this forum every year is that we have more people every time. And the truth is that this amount of people would not fit in any of the other venues where we had this event before. So we really appreciate from El Colegio de México the venue created for this event. Every year, when we organize this event with the participation of more institutions, we always go from the most immediate memory. To say that we have an incredible development of democracy in our region, in the Americas. And we're not so sure if that is a reality or not, because we're going to use this forum to talk about the weaknesses and the advantages. But the truth is that we have never had a period as such in this region. Not only because we have fully legal and valid electoral systems with free, transparent, and participating elections, and the results are acknowledged. And sometimes before, the government that was elected was of a different color that believed in one. So we have this, but not only that, we have more democratic stability. We have seen it this morning, at least during my administration at the OAS. Only 2 governments had not finished their administration, one in Honduras because of the coup d'etat, and the other one because of what happened with the president. But it was maybe one government per year, the one that changed all the time. So that's also success. I think we have progress in the area of human rights. Of course, there is a lot to be done. And I think, for example, the situation of women is not enough yet. We need to have more participation, even though it has progressed. So we can say that we have had years of a set of democratic goals that we have achieved, which is important to put on the table. I think that in spite of all this, in spite that we also have the other democratic region with Europe, and even though we have had years with a lot of economic prosperity, as it has been said before, we have a situation that looks like a paradox. And as it has already been said, there is a feeling of lack of satisfaction in the Americas when talking about democracy. And there is a feeling of growing demand from different citizens that could improve not only the performance of democracy, but also its yield, that the democracy can be capable of giving to each citizen the living conditions that they deserve. Dante Caputo, I should have mentioned his name before because he is the father of this initiative, is the demandable democracy. Why this happens? I think that this uncertainty in our democracy happens because something that we created ourselves. No one could be more responsible for these than the governments of the Americas. In 2001, on September 11, 2001, they entered a democratic charter, the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And the first article reports to all the citizens of the Americas that they have the right to democracy and that the governments have the obligation, the duty of guaranteeing that right. And that charter, once again, instead of limiting democracy to just the electoral topic, it has created, and it was said by Caputo this morning, a very wide concept of citizenship that takes into account the politicians or the politics, the human aspect and the social aspect, the political, social and human aspect. I'm not going to summarize the charter, but it says that you should not only be elected by the democracy, you have to rule with democracy, with political pluralism, with transparency, with participation, without discrimination, etc., etc., etc. And then it also says that the citizens have the right to development, that the citizens are also part, or that citizens include a social group, and that we have to help with our democratic effort. And of course, this is a goal that we have progressed, but we have not reached. So it's still a challenge. In Latin America, I am totally sure that there are some situations that are totally incompatible with the concept of democracy, that are totally unacceptable with the concept of democracy because of the incredible lack of equality, because of the levels of violence that are totally incompatible with the society that is based upon democracy. And of course, the very visible lack of satisfaction with the level of confrontation because of the lack of governability that happens in our countries because of the lack of consensus. And I think democracy also establishes the need of having consensus. It demands that besides the confrontations that politics have, there has to be a space where all the democratic people are going to agree, especially when they are going to set changes for the society. I don't think that there is a great rejection for politics here. I think the paradox is actually the fact that as democracy advances, there are more people adding up to democracy. The surveys show that the citizens of the Americas respond favorable to the question that if they think that democracy is the best way of government and if it should be present or not. I think that we have progressed there. However, there is a rejection to politics, but maybe not to politics, but to this individualist attitude that affects everyone. Politics was said by one distinguished scholar in this country, who I quoted many years ago, and whose phrase has been totally adopted by me, Mr. Camille. He said, "Politics is better." That's the goal of the forum, and I thank you for your attendance.
Thank you, Secretary General of the OAS. And now we give the microphone to Emilio Traifet, Minister of Public Education of Mexico. Mr. Secretary General of the OAS, Mr. President of the Federal Electoral Institute, Honorable Presidium, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I salute you on behalf of the President Enrique Peña Nieto, and I explain his absence in this important event due to a commitment he himself made of going to Indonesia, that upon his return from this trip he would immediately get to the areas affected by the recent tropical storms that have fallen on our national territory. Democracy as an ideal is not against democracy as a reality. The incomprehensibility of its analysis starts from us referring to the idea, and some other times to it as a reality, forgetting about the integrity of the concept. With interest and enthusiasm, some political scholars, citizens, and other guests have come together here at this fourth Forum on Latin American Democracy, organized by the OAS, the Federal Electoral Institute, the Colegio de Mexico, the Fondo de Cultura Económica, and the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. In the last 30 years, Latin American countries, as we have said here, have consolidated the democratical processes within themselves in a framework of growing citizen participation and stability of its institutions. Thanks to the effort of several generations, our societies have now conquered a solid democracy on electoral terms. Today, an effective vote is something common in the Americas. We have free elections and governments that stem from the vote of the populations. In our nations there's a plurality, party competence, and there's advantages and disadvantages of the institutions, and an ongoing oversight and inspection of the public life. For Latin Americans, living in democracy does not only mean living in equality the election days, but also moving forward to an equality of opportunities in life. As our democracies have extended, it's also become a generalization, all the social tendencies, the social policies whose trend is to improve the quality of life of the majorities. Notwithstanding its relevance, these advances are still slow, and they're still falling short of the citizens' expectations. The feeling of most of the inhabitants is that democracy hasn't translated into a better quality of life for their families or their communities. According to the Latin Barometer of 2013, the perception of government for all people has fallen from 39 to 35%, while only 20% considers that the population is made up with a fair distribution of the wealth. While we are having advances in the right direction, our nations are now sharing the challenge and urgency of starting a second transition. Going from electoral democracy to a democracy of full rights. Our citizens must have democratic institutions that are capable of providing certainty that they can have a good job, a dignified income, which covers which meets their needs for health, food and education, social security, as well as their access to cultural means. To achieve this purpose, there is not a shortcut, not a fast solution. It is required that every country achieves a democracy that's efficient and has results. A democracy that has a social capacity that transforms. Latin America is today facing a challenge of going forward as a true society of rights based on efficient governments and a growing social participation in a framework of transparency and accountability. Mexico is rising with a lot of changes under the exercise of a democratic presidency to which Enrique Peña Nieto committed on his first day as president. His government is open and sensible to the people, and it decided on increasing the benefits of development, distributing them in a more equitable way, and guaranteeing the universality of the constitutional rights. His government listens, attends for the needs of the people, convinced that the government actions should give an answer to the demands of the most